Distinguished Speaker Program of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Council President Patrick Ryan, and today we present a new edition of our series, In Focus, Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Starting in January, the World Affairs Council presented this series on the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine, launched on February 24th. We've been honored to host Ambassador John Kornblum and other specialists in these programs. You can find the full archive, videos, podcasts, and transcripts of In Focus programs on the tnwac.org website. This series of conversations has been presented in partnership with the American Council on Germany. The ACG is a nonpartisan organization that works to strengthen German-American relations. ACG is a frequent partner in many of the councils of the World Affairs Network. We thank ACG President Dr. Steve Sokol, who'll join us later, for his work with us to foster global affairs awareness. I'd also like to thank our Tennessee program partners for this series and all that we do at TNWAC, the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, the Belmont University Center for Global Citizenship, and the University of Tennessee Center for Global Engagement. One last piece of housekeeping. This World Affairs Council, an all-volunteer effort, is a public service organized and made possible by your financial support. Please become a member and make a donation to help make our global affairs awareness work possible. You can visit tnwac.org to give. Thank you. Now on to our program. Ambassador John C. Kornblum has a long record of service in the United States and Europe, both as a diplomat and as a businessman. He is recognized as an eminent expert on U.S.-European political and economic relations, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Germany from 1997 to 2001. Before that, he occupied a number of high-level diplomatic posts, including U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Special Envoy for the Dayton Peace Process, U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Deputy U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and U.S. Minister and Deputy Commandant of Forces in divided Berlin. Ambassador, thank you again for joining us. Welcome, and
my pleasure.
I'd welcome your opening remarks on the situation as we see it on December 6th in what's happening in Ukraine and Russia.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and good day to everyone who's watching, and also, of course, to Steve Sokol and the American Council on Germany. I think this situation within and around Ukraine, the relationship with Russia, and in recent weeks, of course, the relationship with China also, have all demonstrated how difficult the current years and the coming years are going to be, how much change, how much tumult there's going to be. And I'm very grateful for an opportunity to discuss it with you, because I think the more discussion we have of the very deep underlying issues that are confronting us, the better off we'll be. As far as the situation in Europe is concerned, we are now slightly past the 9-month anniversary of the war, which Russia started last February. And Ukraine was expected to fold within a week or so, and in fact, it's now 9 months later, and Ukraine is on the offensive. And it's Russia who, in fact, is on the defensive. This has been partially because of support from outside of Ukraine, especially the United States, but also because of the tenacity, the dedication, and the energy of the entire Ukrainian society, not just the military forces, but everyone in that country has been an amazing, amazing supporter, not just of Ukrainian independence, but of course of the cause of democracy in Europe. So I think that from the United States point of view, we feel quite proud at the ability to help support Ukraine, but also quite concerned about what could come out of this situation, because if it turns out the wrong way, it's going to be bad for everyone, for Ukraine, for our country, and by the way, also for Russia. The best thing is some writers in the press have been arguing recently, certainly the best thing for the Russian people would be a defeat in Ukraine, so that they could have a new government and make hopefully a new start on a modern democratically oriented government. But also for the West, a Russian suppression of independence and freedom in Ukraine would be anything but a positive development for us, and we would have to deal very thoroughly with some very difficult issues. The issues which have come up in recent weeks are twofold. One of them is one which we're very aware of here in Central Europe, maybe in Tennessee less so, and that is called winter. It is dark, it is cold, the roads are frozen, the soldiers have a hard time keeping up with their energy. And both the Russians in particular seem to have dug in for the winter and are transferring the war from a conflict of militaries to a conflict of weapons in the air. And they have said that they're going to destroy Ukraine's electro power grid, that they're going to attack various civilian sites, which they have been doing, but not as successfully as they might have, because they seem to be running out of weapons. And secondly, because the Ukrainian forces are still very well organized, very active, and very well supplied, mostly by the United States, so that the Russians find it very hard to make any progress, even if they are creating terror. And this leads to the final point I'd like to make as an introduction. This is a war, there's no question about it, but it's also an exercise in terrorism. And the European Parliament and the German Parliament last week both declared Russia to be a terrorist state, not simply a state fighting for some interests, but rather a state that uses sponsored state terrorism. This is going to be one of the big issues in the weeks and months to come, because Ukraine is really suffering from this territory. They're just shooting indiscriminately at civilian buildings, at schools, at hospitals, whatever. And this is taking the war into a whole new field, which is inhumane on the one matter, but also very difficult for us to deal with on the other side. And so it's things are not getting easier, they're getting more complicated, but they're moving more into the humanitarian side and perhaps a bit of way, at least in the winter, from the military side.
Thanks for that, Ambassador. You mentioned the impact of winter on the theater of combat. We've seen in the last couple of weeks scores of missile attacks against Ukraine from Russia against infrastructure targets, especially the electric power grid. Mercy Corps is saying that the grid could collapse by Christmas time, and that it's going to make it very difficult for residents in the cities that are being struck. And in the last 24 hours, we've seen drone strikes from Ukraine. Presumably, they have not claimed attribution for these strikes, but strikes against Russian air bases 300 miles or so inside Russia and an airport not too far from the border. But we see kind of an evolution of the combat from the ground war in the east and south to strategic strikes by drones and missiles. Are we likely to see much in the way of ground combat, or are we going to have a winter of aerial combat? What's your read on where we are in terms of the on the ground situation?
Well, it's hard to say because we're not there and we don't know how the Ukrainians see their situation, but certainly the climate is now going to work against the military forces on both sides. It is dark and cold there in the winter. I was commenting earlier when we started here, I'm talking to you from Berlin, where it is now 10 minutes after 5. And it's already been dark for 2.5 hours here. We get very little sunlight during the summer, and Ukraine gets even less because they're further east than we are. And so I think that this new trend, which just started maybe 10 days ago, of shooting weapons from a long distance at the other side is two things. At first, it's probably a different way now of pursuing the war, and it's just almost by definition it's one which involves civilians more than it did before. So that makes the humanitarian side of it very difficult. But also it's a big challenge for the West, but in particular for the United States. It's well known that we have shipped literally billions of dollars worth of weapons to Ukraine since February of last year. It is also generally well known that these weapons have been decisive in the ability of Ukraine to hold off the Russians and to actually take back territory from Russians. But now, if the war is going to go into a different phase, shall we call it a long distance phase, there are other kinds of American weapons which we haven't so far sent. Something called the ATACMS, which is a very, very sophisticated anti-aircraft weapon. And there's also different kinds of drones that we have. There's something called the Gray Eagles, which up until about 3 weeks ago, the name was even classified where we were supposed to talk about it. There are lots of other things that the United States could send now. And I can tell you from personal observation that there is a heavy debate going on in Washington right now about what to do about this. Because it is a question of cost also, by the way, but it's not just a question of cost, it's a question also of whether the war gets expanded or not. That leads then maybe to one final point that fits in here very well, and that is that there continues to be, especially in Europe, a further development, a further push for something which one might call a diplomatic solution to this, to somehow to convince the two parties to stop shooting. This is a very European way of dealing with issues because they live in a very small piece of territory, and so they react very negatively to too much destruction. The French president was here last week, Mr. Macron, and he, on the one hand, gave total support to Ukraine and total support for what the United States is doing. But he, at the same time, came up and said that we need to have a whole new redefinition of our security policies in Europe. We need to have a new security structure with Russia, and we need to try and work more with Russia to stop this war. Now, put to you, not translating it from the French, but translating it from the bureaucratic English, what he meant was make concessions to Russia. That is what Mr. Macron was saying. He said it in no uncertain terms. Actually, the German Chancellor, Mr. Schulz, has been less open and less active on this, but he too is known to believe that negotiations would be better. And he actually had a phone call with Putin last week in which he supposedly made this point very strongly. So one of the great successes of the American government so far has been to hold the Western alliance together. There are no signs right now that it is not standing together. The fact the Macron visit was a very big success for President Biden. But this is going to be, as the war drags on, this is going to be another issue which is going to make things difficult. It's going to lead to much more debate, and which is going to lead to different kinds of solutions for what's going on there right now.
As part of the aerial attacks against Ukraine, there was an incident several weeks ago in which a weapon fell across the border into Poland, and it generated a lot of heat and not a lot of light, as the reflexive reaction, especially in the media, was that this was a Russian attack against a NATO country and the implications of that. Can you give us a little color as to what the implications of that kind of thing would be if it had been a Russian weapon? As it turns out, it was likely a Ukrainian anti-air missile that fell errantly across the border.
Well, of course, had it been provable, and had it been a Russian attack on Poland, that would have changed the entire both legal and strategic situation of the conflict, because Poland is a member of NATO, and the membership in NATO includes a commitment of the others to come to your defense at any time if you feel threatened. Poland certainly feels threatened right now. It doesn't have to have a Russian missile shot at it to feel threatened. But the fact is that Western countries, in this case, I must stress, especially Germany, has been supporting Poland very, very strongly. So they have no reason not to be satisfied with Western support. But if Russian weapons started falling on Poland, then we would be faced with the question of retaliation. So that's a very big issue that the administration tries to play down as much as it can. But that's why there was so much interest in the origin of this rocket. And it seems to have been a Polish anti-aircraft missile that got off track and landed in the city in Ukraine rather than where it should have been landing. So that's so far okay. It's not okay that the missile landed and someone was killed because of that, but that happens sometimes in warfare, and so we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
You mentioned Mr. Macron's pronouncements about the situation and negotiations. There was also a conversation when he was in Washington last week that President Biden was open to meet with Putin, but
Right.
that there were certain conditions, and then the Kremlin shot back that the grounds for negotiation would be recognition of the annexation of the 4 regions
Right.
on the east. What's your take on that back and forth?
Well, there always has been, even through the high points of the war, a desire in Europe to talk about these things. Americans have a view of themselves, a sort of can do, we'll go out there and make things happen. The Europeans' view of themselves, especially if there's a conflict, is that we will work hard to find a peaceful solution to the conflicts. We've had enough warfare in our history, and we don't want to have any more. That is a long standing, and as if you want to call it, a deep-seated difference between the United States and its European friends. They believe in the very strong need to work out ways of negotiating for peace. We believe in winning wars, and there's a lot of distance between those two things. Now, there's a piece of diplomatic jargon that Macron used when he was in Washington, which caused a good deal of uproar in Washington and some other uproar, other different kind of uproar in Europe. And that is, he said, it is time to find a new security structure with Russia. Now, what does that mean? We never use the word in America. In fact, we don't even use the word world order, which the Europeans love to use all the time. We don't use that word very much either. A security structure for Europe means that we would somehow meet Russia's needs. And Russia has been, in fact, telling us for 5 or more years, maybe 10 years even, what their idea of a new security structure would be. And essentially, it would boil down to a sphere of influence. That we would say security in Europe depends on the maintenance of NATO and defense and everything, that's fine. We would also say that peace in Europe depends on Russia being able to control its border areas and territory around its border. This would mean that countries, not only Ukraine, but the countries in the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. It would also mean Moldova. It would also mean the countries out in Central Asia, Uzbekistan or Turkestan. But they would also go back into the status that they had until 1990 as being Soviet satellites. This time it would be Russian satellites. And so no serious person in the West, especially in the United States, wants to be in favor of such a new security structure with Russia. But it's interesting that Macron put it forward. The French always tried to be a bit forward-looking, especially when dealing with Russia. And it was taken note of by very many people when he made that proposal in Washington last week. Interestingly enough, the American papers hardly reported it because our journalists don't know what a new security structure would be. But the Europeans knew very well, and it drew a great deal of interest in the European press.
We have some questions already in the queue, Ambassador, and I'll touch on one of them. But I'd also like to invite our participants to put their questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. The first question we have comes from Professor Angela Weck. She's the executive director of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, and a big hat tip to them. We're proud to be the co-winners with Peoria in the 2022 World Affairs Councils of America Council of the Year. So hat tip to Angela and her colleagues there on sharing that award with Tennessee World Affairs Council. Angela asks, going back to the escalation question and the case of the missile strike into Poland, she's wondering if the strikes into Russian territory, not just strikes against Russian targets in eastern Ukraine, but into Russian territory proper, might open the door to escalation. It appears that Putin may get a propaganda bonanza by telling Russians that, see, I told you that these strikes against the Russian motherland are indicative of what we're dealing with the Ukrainians, but also it does open the door to use of unconventional weapons or taking the conflict into areas where it has not been before. What's your worry about escalation as a result of the Ukrainian attacks into Russian territory?
Well, I'm not as worried as some people are, because I think that the brakes on escalation are fairly high, and also that Russia doesn't really have very many means of escalating at the moment. One thing we have to remember is that the Russian military is pretty worn out. It's pretty short of ammunition. It's short of soldiers. It's short, and its morale is low. So if I were a Ukrainian strategist, and I'm sure that this is the way they're looking at the world, they would say, well, on the one hand, if we hit into Russia, it could cause people to be more sympathetic to Putin, or it could cause the Russians to become angry. On the other hand, if we don't hit into Russia, it means that Russia can shoot at us at will, and we need to send them a signal that we're not going to simply accept their shooting at us one way. So it's a very complicated issue. I'm sure that the United States government has been talking with the Ukrainians in great detail about whether this is the right thing to do. But it does build up morale in Ukraine. And the fact that the Ukrainians have been able to, with impunity, actually conduct some very sophisticated actions against Russia, and in particular against its Navy, is something which is not a positive development for Putin. It's a great deal of dissatisfaction in Russia that this has been happening. But you can be sure that our government is working very hard with Ukrainians to make sure that, and that's some of the weapons deliveries which I mentioned earlier, have been determined also by the fact how dangerous they would be in expanding the war.
Do you think the conversations that Macron and Biden had last week, and the eruption of let's negotiate with Putin, may be undermining Zelensky in any way? What's the third leg of the stool situation regarding conversations with the Kremlin?
No, I don't think they're undermining Zelensky, but they might be sending Zelensky certain messages that you have to take account of this, and you can't just be shooting away at will. It's very hard, even for the president of the United States, to understand exactly what the situation on the ground is like in Ukraine right now. It's just very hard. And so it's not going to be American policy, I'm sure, to openly pull back the Ukrainians from doing things they're doing. On the other hand, I know from my own discussions that it has been part of our policy for some time to, shall we say, counsel a little bit of restraint on the Ukrainians, and when they could inflict really major damage, maybe we've told them not to do so or asked them not to do so. And so it's a very difficult game which is being played. Nobody can quite determine what the right course of action is, and nobody can quite determine who should be encouraged or who should not be encouraged.
We have a question from Dr. Winfried Schmitz, who asks about the 1990s effort to bring Russia into NATO and why not look at that as a long-term solution. But let me put on the table the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO and conversations with the EU as well. Where do you think those conversations stand, and what's the outlook for that membership?
Well, I'll start with that one first. There was some very dramatic steps taken just in the last 2 weeks, both in Brussels and in some capitals. And if Putin's goal was to block Ukrainian membership in NATO, he has failed completely on this, because now NATO has come out with absolute total certainty. This was a statement made by the NATO, I think, foreign ministers last week, that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. I don't think we'd ever said that before. The European Union said the same thing not more than 2 months ago, that Ukraine belonged in the European Union and it was on a track to become a member of the European Union. I don't think we'd ever said that before either. So on that side of things, Ukraine is doing actually quite well in getting its membership at least more accepted than it had been. And if you have followed some of the suggestions of diplomatic solutions, one of them always is, one of the aspects of it always is, Ukraine would give up the right to join NATO and would get security guarantees in return. Well, we did that in 1994. In fact, I was one of the drafters of the paper that we gave to the Ukrainians, saying that we would guarantee their security if they gave up their nuclear weapons. And so that getting security guarantees from Russia is not exactly a very good way to go. Now, the question of Russia and NATO is a very interesting one for me, because again, I was there talking with them about that in the spring of 1997. The American approach was that we wouldn't want Russia to join NATO now, that we wanted to expand NATO into Central and Eastern Europe, countries who had suffered a great deal under Russian control, but that we wanted to build a security structure with Russia, and that we wanted the security structure to include the possibility of Russia joining NATO at some time in the future. Now, we wanted to put this forward, but we were stopped by our NATO allies, our European NATO allies, and we honored their request, because they were worried that if we offered NATO membership to Russia, they would immediately have to offer EU membership to Russia. And that would mean that Russia's relationship with the European Union would become very complicated, and the European Union itself would find it really hard to deal with a Russian member, shall we say. So that was you can argue whether that was a opportunity missed or not. I presume myself, I believe that it probably wasn't as big an opportunity as some people might think, but at the same time, it wouldn't have been bad had we been offering Russia that kind of future. And we'd been offering them a chance to become part of the, shall we call it, the civilized world. And it would have been good if we could have done that.
Well, you talked about the certainty of the NATO ministers. Let's expand the conversation about the failure of Putin's actions in view of NATO by talking about the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO as one more failure of the whole Russian adventure here. Are you up to date on the status of how that's going? There was conversation about Turkey being the sticking point.
The only real sticking point now is Turkey. And Turkey's problem is more with Sweden than with Finland. Because Sweden over the past, well, maybe 5 or more years, maybe 10 years, I'm not sure, has been welcoming Kurdish dissidents from Turkey as giving them political asylum. And I know from my own background that there's nothing more sensitive to the Turkish government as regard whether it's who the head of it is, than the activities of Kurdish separatists in Turkey. Some people may remember that the United States gave a great deal of support to the Kurdish Republic in northern Iraq, and that the Turks, even though these people were our allies, they attacked them militarily because they claimed that they were running guerrilla operations inside of Turkey. So it's one of the most sensitive, difficult areas with Turkey, and an area where Turkey has no hesitation of fighting back. Now, they have been in ongoing, deep, careful discussions, as they say in the diplomatic world, with Sweden to see if there is some way that they can get the Swedes to, shall we say, lessen their support for these Kurdish dissidents. Not give them, at the moment, they've been sort of welcomed with open arms, because, I mean, let's be honest, I myself also agree with the goals of the Kurdish dissidents, but as a good American diplomat, I never said so publicly because the Turks would not be happy with that. And so we'll see what happens, but I can't imagine that Turkey would allow this to be the one sticking point blocking membership by Finland and Sweden in NATO. That would be a great blow also to Turkish reputation. But there's still a few weeks left before the deadline, and so they're going to probably be negotiating right up to the very end of the day.
We're going to bring in Dr. Steve Sokol here in a minute, but let me return to the Kremlin. Alex Wise has a question. Alex says, it looks as though there's no internal pressure on Putin that he has to pay attention to. Do you see any signs that Putin is feeling some heat internally?
No, I don't see any signs. I agree with you, Alex. That doesn't mean there isn't any, because we don't really know how the system works there. The CIA doesn't really know how the system works there. But the fact, on the other side of the coin is the fact that Putin is looking bad and worse every day. His fortunes are not good. His military strategy is not working. His international diplomatic strategy is not working. The Russian, one thing that you can, I guess, glean from the publications of the intelligence community, and that is that the Russian economy is getting weaker and weaker all the time. And there's a big debate, as you know, going on right now about what the oil price for Russian oil should be. Nothing is really going very well for Russia right now. And so it wouldn't be surprising if Putin might be trying to find some opening for compromise, an opening which would not cause him to have to give up very much.
We have a question from Nick McCall, who references conversations back in 1989 with West Germany. John McLaughlin having said it was difficult to imagine the future with any certainty. Can you give us your thoughts on where this is heading? Then we'll turn to some German issues with Dr. Sokol. But where do you see, Ambassador Kornblum, the short and medium term developments that once we get past the weaponized winter, we're back in the spring in combat, and Putin is still facing economic issues. Where are we going with all this?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. We will have a different Congress in the United States, for example. Not that much different, but one vote is enough. And the Republicans have so far been very supportive of President Biden's approach to Ukraine and his military support for Ukraine, but who knows, maybe they will have a different strategy. So that's one variable. I'm not predicting anything, I'm just saying it's a variable which we don't know about yet. Another variable is how difficult the winter is going to be in Europe in particular, where oil prices are going to be, where oil supplies are going to be, whether governments in Europe feel very much under pressure because of the oil prices. I can tell you, as someone living in Germany, it's every single day there's a discussion about how high one can turn up one heats, can one take a shower, I mean, it's getting down to the very basics of human life. And so that could have a political impact also, you can't tell. And finally, then, is the question of the ability of Ukraine to maintain its defenses, to maintain its counterattack to Moscow, and the ability of the Russians to continue their attacks. I'm assuming that the answer for both sides is that they will be able to maintain their military strength, and they will be able to do something. Russia's strength, as we know, is much less than it seemed to be a year ago, but it doesn't mean it's nothing. And so that's going to be very difficult. So you can see that there are several things coming together. And we might add, this is far from any expert knowledge I have, but it has not escaped people's view that China is having very great difficulties right now. And that the idea that there was this solid China behind Putin all the time is pretty much faded away. President Xi has himself said several times that he was not really in favor of the kind of military strategy that Russia is pursuing. So you're dealing here with many, many different variables which cannot be predicted. I wouldn't even try to. But the good news is that the West is very united right now, that Ukraine's morale is very strong and it can hold out for a good deal longer, and that the basic issues which affect the strength of both Russia and China are not in their favor at the moment. Russia and China are both dealing with very difficult internal economic situations and external political situations.
Well, we'll continue with the Q&A tab, so please continue to add your questions there. But now allow me to introduce my colleague and partner in these programs, Dr. Steve Sokol, president of the American Council on Germany. Steve, thanks for joining us. I know you've got some conversations about the German perspective on what's happening in Ukraine, and the floor is yours to continue the conversation with Ambassador Kornblum.
Patrick, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to step in and ask a couple questions as well. As always, we are delighted to partner with you in the Tennessee World Affairs Council. And John, it is great to see you. It seems like too good an opportunity to not pass up on some German-related questions, since you're in Germany and have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. And I thought I'd maybe pull a couple of threads together. We have a viewer question from someone who's in Germany who just posted a headline that Hungary has blocked 18 billion euro in support for Ukraine. And he's curious how we can or should deal with friction within the NATO alliance or between EU member states in our common approach to Ukraine.
That's a very good question. When this war started, one of the Western weak points was listed as being the inability to maintain unity in fighting this battle against Russia, for a whole lot of reasons that you know very well. Fact is that unity has been maintained, and that the Europeans have come up with, in fact, with high levels of coordination, of cooperation, and for example, the welcoming approach they've taken with refugees. There have been literally millions of refugees from Ukraine. And refugees, as in the United States, are sometimes considered to be a political difficulty. This time it hasn't been at all. They have been taken in, they have been put in school, the children have been given clothes, et cetera, et cetera. It's turned out to be a really very good example of how you can work together. But at the same time, there are internal differences in the European Union, which have little to do with Ukraine. And Hungary is one of them, as anyone who follows it knows. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Mr. Orbán, believes that he should have a more independent role in Europe than the rest of the Europeans believe he should have. And he's been, in fact, blocking agreements on other things, not on Ukrainian things, but on other things over the past few months. That's what Europe is all about. And that's one can, I think the closest thing I can bring to the table in discussing this is something that I think most of our viewers would probably nod their head in understanding immediately. Dealing with the European Union is like dealing with the American Congress. It's a very powerful body, but it has very many different points of view and very many conflicts between its members, just as we have in our own Congress.
You know, John, since you're talking about sort of European unity and the show of Western unity in the face of this crisis, I'd like to maybe ask you to unpack for us how you see unity within Germany holding up. As recently as, I guess, late September, polls indicated that more than 70% of the public supported the German government's efforts to support Ukraine. But as winter sets in, and as you described, as heating prices go up, how long do you think that unity and support will hold in Germany, given that the perception is that the war is very far away?
Good question. Well, nobody knows. One thing that you can say about Germany, and I've lived here a long time and would agree with this, is that they tend to do better in times of crisis than they do in times of plenty. And when the Germans are faced with a real challenge, with a threat, they tend to deal with that threat very successfully and very determinedly. It's when the threat is not so clear and where there are many different courses of action, where the complexity of German society, or European society for that matter, leads to very difficult discussions. So I'm not too worried about that. I am more worried about whether the dynamics of the war is going to continue, and whether the German government will be facing with internal difficulties about how to deal with the details of the war, not the overall support for Ukraine. There's no question about that. But as we know, there are dozens of details, and some of them are just far from an overall agreement on those.
Mm-hmm. So, John, I mean, you just said that Germans, deal well with change, but I think we both know that Germans also like continuity, and of course this new government has only been in office for a year. This week actually marks the 1-year anniversary of Olaf Scholz's time in the Chancellery and his traffic light coalition. And it's a government that has really been buffeted by crises, coming in with the COVID-19 pandemic, having to deal with the war in Ukraine. And of course, Olaf Scholz gave his big Zeitenwende speech, which indicated a major policy pivot in foreign policy, security policy, energy policy. As you sort of reflect on this past year and where the government is, how do you think the government is responding to the variety of crises that it's dealing with, and particularly this crisis in Ukraine? Can and should it be doing more?
Well, there's a big debate about can and should it be doing more. If you listen to the German defense minister or to other people, they'll tell you that they've been doing a great deal. If you listen to the Lithuanians or the people on the front or the Ukrainians themselves, they would say there would be more they could do. Part of it, if you want to be totally honest about it, is that the Germans have been very successful in building relations with the Biden administration. And they are very sensitive to the limits that the Biden administration is putting on itself. For example, main battle tanks. The Germans, is something that Germany has been proud of for 100 years, builds the best tanks in the world, and they haven't sent any to Ukraine. We build maybe the second best tanks in the world, and we haven't sent any to Ukraine either. And so it's very complicated right now. What I would say, however, is that I have to correct you a little bit, Steve. I didn't say that they deal easily with change. I said they deal easily with adversity. If change is coming in a time of great plenty, as we've had in recent years, they don't do very well at that. They tend to sit back and enjoy the benefits of their the fruits of their labor, shall we say. But when things go badly for them is when the Germans are at their very best. And we can think back, 75 years now to Berlin crises and things like that, where the residents of Berlin just stuck it out for winter after winter with the Russians blocking coal supplies there too. So it's not that anything's going to fall apart. I think that's the important thing that for our listeners that we state. NATO is not going to fall apart. The European Union has been dealing quite steadily with this stuff. It's not that it's going to fall apart. The big issue that we face right now is what our choices should be. Is it and you right now, of course, in the very open debate which is going on this, the choices go all the way from trying to destroy Russia to otherwise maybe what Mr. Macron was saying, let's find a way of helping Russia guarantee its own security, something like that. Russia is a very difficult country, a very inscrutable country, and so it's very hard to understand what the right recipe for dealing with Russia would be. And we're nowhere near that, I think, if I can say that as an observer living here in Germany, but also watching what's going on in Washington. We're not really up to speed yet on how we should move the course of this conflict in the future. And that's very difficult. And it's something that I'm sure lots of people are worried about, but I don't think that anybody has come up with an answer yet.
Thanks for that, John, and thanks for the clarification. Let me maybe just ask one more sort of Germany-related question and Scholz-related question, and then hand it back to Pat to take some more viewer questions. You said, I think, at the beginning of our conversation today that many people had anticipated sort of a quick victory for Russia when this war started, and of course it was just 3 days after the war, this phase of the war began, that Olaf Scholz held his Zeitenwende speech. And I think if one looks at that speech just days after the war started and one looks at it now, 9 months later, one can draw sort of some different conclusions from it. It seems in some ways as if it was written almost anticipating that Russia might win and what Germany might need to do, but not necessarily written in a way that makes you think that this war between Russia and Ukraine would drag on for months, has the potential to become what I describe as sort of a hot frozen conflict, but something that will continue for quite a while to come.
Right.
How do you sort of put that speech and the steps forward in Germany in context, given that we cannot anticipate a speedy resolution to this conflict?
Well, first, I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a shock to all of us, but to the Germans more than almost anyone else, because they believed that they had built a foundation for peaceful relations with Russia. It was very hard for them to accept that Russia would simply throw everything out the window and start a war. They were, disbelief is a minor phrase compared to, and so I think part of the importance of Scholz's speech, or maybe the goal of Scholz's speech, was to reassure the public that he had this great disappointment under control, which he may or may not have. I'm not saying he did, but he was trying to. This is what political leaders do. They try to say something to their publics which may give them a feeling of stability. So I think what he was saying in that speech was not, as was often misinterpreted in the West, that Germany is all of a sudden going to be the Fort Bragg of the world, not at all. That never was going to be the case. But what I think he was trying to say to his own people and his own voters, but also to his allies, that Germany was going to step up and fulfill the needs as they were seen. And that whatever people thought about Germany being too friendly to Russia or building a pipeline or whatever, that era was over. But he did not promise that a new era would all of a sudden just start. And I had many debates with people back a year ago about this, when they said, well, so look at that. Now he's going to come in with 2 battalions of tanks and air fighters and Lord knows what. No, that's not the way change takes place in Germany. Change takes place in Germany on the basis of slowly evolving consensus. And this consensus has evolved. If I were to try and compare the consensus today with the consensus a year ago, it is much firmer, much more in favor of Western solidarity, much more against the Russian goals, but it is not in favor of having the kind of ambitious, even almost glorified approach to military support that, say, the French still have, or which you can find in certain parts of the United States. You're not going to ever find that in Germany, because they went through an experience which is, we could use the term in America, a near-death experience. They were just about wiped out by the last time that they tried to be a big military power. And even though it's now almost 80 years ago that the war ended, it's still very, very deep in the genes of younger generations. I talk a lot with people about military security. I have some groups that I've set up actually to do it, and you don't find anybody who believes in the kind of aggressive approach that, say, Macron talks about sometimes for France. Nobody would do that here in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Ambassador, let me bundle a couple of questions here in our remaining minutes, and you can choose from among them, or pick out one that strikes your fancy here. From Richard Glossinger, Robert Kapanji, and Robert Alschuler, the questions are, what is likely to happen in the long term in the areas occupied by Russians in Ukraine as a result of Russification? Robert Kapanji asks, what do we see as a post-Putin government? And Robert Alschuler is curious about Russian-American relations. He talks about travel to Russia, but what restrictions, if any? So feel free to pick and choose among those questions, and we have a couple minutes left.
Well, first I would say, as part of the dynamic inside of Ukraine, but also the relations that Ukraine has built and the reputation Ukraine has built, that we need, other than to be sorrowful for the horrible losses they've incurred, which are really horrible, the human losses, we need not have too much worry about the future of that country. This is sometimes the irony of history is very dramatic. In trying to destroy the country, Putin took a country which was sort of on the fringes of Western society, not well known, and turned it into a central point of Western modern political and economic culture. And Ukraine is I know Ukraine pretty well, as some of you know. My own wife is a daughter of Ukrainian immigrants. I know Ukraine pretty well, and I can tell you that it itself is going to have a very bright future, with, however, great sorrow from what has happened over the past year. Now, what is the big question, which is being asked now, if you were to look at the foreign policy blogs and articles and everything, the big policy right now is, what do you do about Russia? Russia is not Serbia. I mentioned that because I was a very active member of the delegation to the Dayton negotiations now, a bit more than 20 years ago. And never was there any problem with understanding how we would deal with Serbia. We would beat Serbia, and then we would make them behave themselves, and that's more or less what we've done. You don't do that with Russia. Russia is 100 times bigger than Serbia population-wise, probably 1,000 times bigger than Serbia land-wise. It has a long and difficult, but it's also a very proud history. You're simply not going to go in there, even the way we went into Germany after World War II. You're not going to go in there like that either. After World War II, we simply took German sovereignty away from them and ran the country for 5 years until we deemed them ready to be have self-government again. We're not going to do that with Russia either. So the questions from the viewers who are asking about the future of Russia in a way, you are going to be part of the answer, because it's a question of how do we as Western countries feel about dealing with this country? Do we now so distrust it that we want to keep it under some kind of imprisonment almost for some time? Or do we believe that it has such a potential that we need to get it back into the world economic and political cycle as quickly as possible? Nobody has answers to these questions. I'm sure there are people, individuals, who have their own theories, but nobody has put together a consensus on what to do about Russia. And I certainly wouldn't try to do so. It's very, very complicated. They occupy, what is it, 20% of the world's surface, maybe more. They're not a large country population-wise. I mean, they're still one of the largest countries, but they're losing people regularly. They have about 125, 30 million people right now, and that's probably going to go down quite drastically in the coming years. That's thanks to Putin. But they are such a large country and have such a potential that almost every part of the non-Western world that we think about, Russia plays a role, be it in China, Japan, Taiwan, India, the Himalayas, Pakistan, Iran. You can just go on and on and on. Every big issue that we have in the world cannot be really dealt with without the cooperation of Russia. So we do have to find a way of dealing with Russia. And it's going to be very difficult to try and do it at the same time when you're trying to punish them for what is by far, the most barbaric, bloodthirsty war that Europe has seen since World War II, almost 100 years ago now, 80 years ago. And so it's not going to be easy just to say, okay, Russia, we had a sort of a bad patch there, let's get back to business. That's not going to be easy either. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
I think as an adjunct to that, Ambassador, is our final question from our guests. What purpose does it serve to negotiate with Russia if they can't be trusted and would use a hiatus and hostilities just to rebuild and be prepared for another expanded invasion in a couple of years? And I guess part of that is answered by the fact that there's not negotiations. So leaders probably don't see that there's value in that. But can you just comment on that? And then I'll invite you to make your closing remarks and we'll wrap things up today.
That word, diplomatic negotiations, is something that I spent most of my diplomatic career doing, starting when I was in my mid-20s until being in my late 50s. So I had a lot of time dealing with this. Negotiations don't have to be sitting at a table making positive approaches to other people. Negotiations can also be the refusal to sit at a table with someone. What we are doing with Putin right now is building up our, shall we call it, negotiating leverage by simply ignoring him and refusing to talk with him. And I am in that school. I am not in the school of people who believe that we should somehow, I won't say destroy Russia, but just dismiss them and not deal with them anymore. As I just said in my comments, I don't think we can do that. But I think that the best kind of negotiation we can do with them right now is a sort of a silent negotiation, not trying to pick out areas of agreement, but to pick out areas where we can show that there is disagreement. Now, real quick, I'll talk about my own experience. I was the deputy head of the negotiating team dealing with the Serbs in 1995, 96. And then I became the United States Special Envoy to the Balkans for the next 3 years after that. So I really have dealt with something like this. And when we started negotiations with the Serbs, with Milosevic, in the fall of 1995, our first position that we said to him was, we don't agree on anything. And it's up to you to find things that we agree on. And that had a very interesting effect on him. He thought he was very, what's the right word? dismissive of the Europeans for that matter, because he said they always tried to find out areas where we agreed on things. And we said to him, well, we don't agree on anything. And so if we're going to stop this war, we have to build up some areas of agreement, and that's how we did it. In the same way same thing is actually probably the case with Putin. We do agree with, I hope, with some things with Putin. We don't want to have nuclear war, for example. I think we agree on that. I hope we do. But other than that, there are very few things that we really do agree on with the Russians. And any negotiations that we have with them has to start with that, not with what their desires are. And this is where I do disagree with the European approach. They tend to give in immediately. This is what Macron did when he said we have to find a new European security system which takes account of Russia's interests. Well, no, we don't. There's no reason that we have to do that. Russia has more interest in having us support their interests than we do in having them to agree that we agree with their interests. And so it's going to be very difficult to do this. As you see, what I'm trying to do is not give you any simple answers, but tell you how difficult the process is going to be. But it's going to start sooner or later.
Well, yes, there will be a development in which the scenario changes. Ambassador, any last comments you'd like to share? We're at the end of our time, but anything you'd like to close and leave us with?
In previous discussions, I have talked about why is this important for us, and we're not talking together now as Americans. we are let's not forget, after 2 years of the worst pandemic in history, after many years of the worst climate disasters in history, after a period when we had very heavily confrontational political discussion in our own country, all of a sudden we were called upon to help a country, a faraway country, which we don't know very well, to stave off, to defend itself against Russian aggression. Now, it would be perfectly logical for almost anyone to say, well, there's no interest. Let them shoot it out. We don't care. It's a long ways away. And that, I think, is the important part here, to understand that no place is for us a long ways away anymore. That the smartphone that you're carrying around with you was most likely built in China. The technology of it was most likely developed in Taiwan. And the oil that we're a great producer of oil, but we also import a lot of oil. Much of the oil that we have is coming from countries that we don't really have the highest regard for, such as some countries in the Middle East. I could go on and on. There are no more borders. There are no more blockages to interaction with people, and there's also no more security. We are not any longer secure behind our oceans. The Russians have the capability of destroying the electric grid in the United States if they chose to do so. And they would do it without even us knowing that was happening. So we have to, it is very much in our interest to try and keep control over these kinds of conflicts, which are the kinds of conflicts that we're probably going to bump into in the coming years, because in their essence, they are about change, about the world finding itself in upheaval, whether it be climate change or pandemics or generational change or movement of refugees or Lord knows what else is going on. It's very important that we understand that change is breaking over us and that there's no way of isolating ourselves from it. And that's why Ukraine is important, because if we were to give in on Ukraine, then the entire democratic east of Europe would probably be weakened or maybe even fall away. So we have a very deep stake in what goes on in this part of the world. But that's why I'm so grateful to you, Patrick, and to the World Affairs Councils. It's very important that we keep talking about them, because it's not so easy to figure out, even for the experts. I can assure you, some of you who are listening here are experts, I'm sure, but there are others who aren't. The experts don't know a lot more than you know right now. It's still a very, very difficult situation.
To be sure. And Ambassador, thanks to you for helping us understand the situation there. As you said, it's very complicated, a lot of moving parts, and it seems that every day brings news of some new development in Ukraine and in Russia and the relationships with the West and so forth. So we appreciate your talking with our groups over these months, and we hope that we'll continue to do so. And let me close by just wishing you and your family a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. And we look forward to seeing you back in Nashville, sir.
I look forward to being there, and I also my best wishes to all of your members and all of the people who took the time to watch us today. It was a very great feeling to know that so many people are interested in what's going on. Thank you.
And thanks also to Dr. Steve Sokol and the American Council in Germany for partnering with the Tennessee World Affairs Council on this In Focus series. We look forward to working with Steve and his folks as we enter the new year. And that's it for today. You can find recordings of all of these programs on tnwac.org. And when you're there, please consider becoming a member or making a contribution to make these programs possible. That's it. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. We appreciate you coming. We look forward to our next session, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays. Have a great day.